March 3rd, 1943. 10 in the morning. Bismarck Sea. A Japanese destroyer captain named Masatomi Kimura is standing on the bridge of his flagship. He is 52 years old. He has been in the Imperial Navy for 34 years. He is about to watch 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers, 12 ships in total, nearly 7,000 of his own soldiers, die over the next 48 hours. They will be killed by airplanes that the United States Army's own engineers had declared impossible to fly. The man who built those airplanes was 2,000 miles away in a hangar in Brisbane welding gun mounts by hand. He was 43 years old. He had no engineering degree. His wife and 4 children were in a Japanese prison camp in Manila. He had not seen them in 14 months. His name was Paul Gunn. They called him Papi. And this is the story of how one overaged mechanic in oil-stained coveralls, with a wrench, a welding torch, and every reason in the world to want the Japanese dead, changed the war in the Pacific. To understand what happened over the Bismarck Sea, we have to go back, 14 months back, to a runway in Manila. Manila, December 20th, 1941. The sky over Nichols Field was the color of wet iron. Smoke from burning oil tanks drifted across the runway, low and heavy, like something that couldn't decide whether to rise or fall. Paul Gunn walked toward a Beechcraft Model 18 sitting on the apron. 2 engines, 12 seats, his own airplane. He had bought it in 1938 for Philippine Airlines. Now it belonged to the United States Army. Behind him, his wife Polly stood at the edge of the concrete. Their 4 children stood beside her. Nathaniel 16, Julie 14, Paul Jr. 11, Connie Ann 8. Nathaniel was trying to look calm. Connie Ann was holding her mother's hand so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. Gunn turned around. He looked at them for 1 second, maybe 2. He didn't wave. He didn't say goodbye. He had already said everything that needed to be said the night before in the small house on Dewey Boulevard, with the blackout curtains drawn and the sound of Japanese bombers passing overhead every 20 minutes. He climbed into the cockpit. He started the engines. The Beechcraft rolled forward, lifted off the runway, and turned north toward Australia. Polly watched until the airplane became a speck. Then the speck became nothing. She would not see her husband again for 3 years and 1 month. She did not know that yet. Paul Irving Gunn was 42 years old when the war reached Manila. He was 5 feet 9. Sandy hair going gray at the temples, blue eyes that squinted permanently from 20 years of staring into sun and wind. He had been born in a small town in Arkansas on October 18, 1899. He joined the United States Navy in 1917 at the age of 17. By 1937, he had risen to Chief Aviation Pilot, the highest enlisted flying rank in the Navy. He had never attended college. He had never studied engineering. Everything he knew about airplanes he had learned by taking them apart with his own hands. He retired from the Navy in 1937 and moved his family to Manila. He borrowed money. He bought 5 used Beechcraft airplanes. He started Philippine Airlines with a hangar at Nichols Field and a small crew of employees. By December 1941, the airline was profitable. The children were in school. Polly was pregnant with a 5th child she would later lose. The Gunns owned a home. They had savings. They had made a life. Then Pearl Harbor happened. 9 hours later, Japanese bombers hit Clark Field. 2 days after that, they hit Cavite. By December 20th, Manila was a city waiting to fall. Gunn was reactivated by the United States Army Air Force with the rank of captain. His orders were simple. Fly. Fly whatever the army tells you to fly. Fly it until you can't fly anymore. He flew supplies into Bataan. He flew wounded men out of Corregidor. He flew reconnaissance over Lingayen Gulf, while Japanese fighters hunted him through the clouds. He kept flying until there was nothing left to fly for. In March 1942, he crossed the Timor Sea in a battered transport aircraft and landed at Bachelor Field in northern Australia. He had not seen his family in 3 months. He did not know it, but Polly and the children had already been taken. Santo Tomas internment camp opened its gates on January 7, 1942. The main building was the University of Santo Tomas, a Spanish colonial structure in the center of Manila. The Japanese Imperial Army converted it into a prison for enemy civilians. Americans, British, Australians, Dutch, anyone whose passport made them a threat. Polly Gunn and the 4 children were brought in during the last week of January. 3,700 internees were packed into buildings designed for 2,000 students. Families slept on the floor. Food was rationed. Medicine was scarce. The Japanese guards were not always cruel, but they were always watching. Polly told the children they would be home by Easter. Easter came. They were not home. She told them they would be home by summer. Summer came. They were still there. By the end of 1942, she stopped promising anything. Nathaniel worked in the camp garden. Julie helped the nurses in the makeshift hospital. Paul Jr. traded cigarettes on the black market for extra rice. Connie Ann stopped growing. She had been 8 when she went in. At 9, she still weighed what she had weighed at 7, Australia. Late 1942. Gunn was assigned to the 5th Air Force Depot at Eagle Farm Airfield outside Brisbane. His job was not what he expected. He was 43 years old. The army considered him too old for combat. He was given a desk, a wrench, and a hangar full of broken airplanes. He was told to fix them. He was told nothing more. The younger pilots called him Papi, not because he was fatherly, because he was old. In an Air Force where the average pilot was 22-43, might as well have been 60. He wore oil-stained coveralls instead of a flight suit. He carried a wrench in his back pocket instead of a map case. He slept in a tent with the mechanics. He ate with the mechanics. He drank with the mechanics. He did not complain. But every night in the dark he thought about Polly. He did not know if she was alive. He did not know if his children were alive. He knew only one thing. He was going to build his way back to Manila, one airplane at a time, one bullet at a time, one broken thing that he could make deadly. While Gunn tightened bolts in Brisbane, the 5th Air Force was losing a war it did not understand. The Japanese were reinforcing New Guinea by sea. Convoys of transport ships left the great naval base at Rabaul on New Britain and steamed south along the northern coast of New Guinea. They delivered troops. They delivered rice. They delivered artillery and ammunition and everything an army needs to fight. The Americans could not stop them. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was America's best heavy bomber. It flew at 15,000 feet. It carried 6,000 pounds of bombs. It was accurate against factories, against airfields, against anything that did not move. Against a ship moving at 15 knots on the open ocean, it was almost useless. A B-17 pilot would drop his bombs from 3 miles above the water. By the time the bombs fell that far, the ship had moved. The bombs hit empty ocean. In the summer of 1942, 5th Air Force B-17 dropped hundreds of tons of bombs at Japanese convoys. They sank nothing. The Douglas A-20 Havoc was a light attack bomber. It flew low, it carried machine guns. It could hit a ship, but it had to fly through the ship's anti-aircraft guns to do it. Japanese transports carried 25mm cannons on their decks. Japanese destroyer escorts carried more. In the summer of 1942, 5th Air Force units lost dozens of aircraft trying to attack Japanese convoys. The pilots died in the water. The convoys reached their destinations. The Japanese unloaded their troops. They marched them inland. They killed Americans and Australians in the jungle. And in Brisbane, a 43-year-old captain looked at a broken A-20 sitting in a hangar and started thinking. The problem Gunn realized was not the bombs. The problem was that the bombers could not survive long enough to drop them. If a bomber flew high, it could not hit the ship. If it flew low, the ship's guns killed it before it could get close. The answer, he decided, was to overwhelm the ship's guns before the bomber got into their range, to suppress the deck, to kill the gunners at their weapons, to turn the bomber into something that could shoot back hard enough and fast enough that the ship never got a clean shot. A bomber that could strafe, a strafer. The A-20 Havoc came from the factory with light machine guns in the nose. Those guns bounced off ship armor like pebbles thrown at a car. Gunn needed 50 caliber guns, 4 of them, mounted where the bombardier used to sit, firing forward, firing together, 2,400 rounds per minute combined. He had no authorization to do this. He had no engineering drawings. He had no stress calculations. He had a hangar, a welding torch, and a supply of Browning M2 machine guns stripped from wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters whose pilots were dead. He started welding. He built a steel frame inside the A-20's nose compartment. He bolted 4 machine guns onto the frame. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. Each gun needed a belt of ammunition. The ammunition weighed almost as much as the guns. The airplane's center of gravity shifted forward. The first test pilot took the modified A-20 off the runway at Eagle Farm and almost crashed on takeoff. The nose wanted to drop. The tail wanted to lift. The airplane flew like it was trying to dive into the ground. Gunn spent 2 days rebalancing it. He moved the radio equipment aft. He added lead weights to the tail. He recalculated by feel. The second test pilot took off, flew for 30 minutes and landed. He climbed out and told Gunn the airplane flew like it was angry. But it flew. Gunn had 6 modified A-20s ready by the last week of August 1942. He had done all of this without permission. He was about to be court-martialed. On August 4, 1942, a new commander arrived at 5th Air Force headquarters in Brisbane. His name was George Churchill Kenny. He was 53 years old, short, stocky, balding. He had a face like a bulldog and a temper to match. But there was something else about General Kenny that no one in the 5th Air Force yet understood. He was not just a career officer. He was a trained aeronautical engineer. He had graduated from MIT. He had spent the interwar years studying aircraft design, gun mounting systems, and combat aerodynamics. When Kenny walked into Eagle Farm Depot for his first inspection tour, he did not see an unauthorized modification project run by an overaged captain who was about to be relieved of duty. He saw an A-20 with 450 caliber machine guns in the nose. He stopped walking. He stared at the airplane for a long time. Then he turned to the officer beside him and asked, "Whose idea was this?" The officer pointed at a man in oil-stained coveralls standing at the back of the hangar. Kenny walked over. He looked at Gunn. Gunn looked back at him. Kenny said one sentence. "Build me 12 more. Then do it to a B-25. Gunn saluted. He said nothing. That afternoon he walked back to his tent and sat on his cot for a long time. He was not being court-martialed. He was being promoted in effect, if not in rank. Kenny had just given him the resources to build an entire fleet. But Gunn was not thinking about resources. He was thinking about Polly. Manila was 2,000 miles north of Brisbane. If he modified 12 A-20s, they might reach the Philippines. If he modified B-25 Mitchell's bigger airplanes, longer range, heavier, bomb loads, those might reach Manila itself. Every gun he mounted was a gun that could kill Japanese soldiers guarding his wife. He picked up his wrench. He got back to work. In September 1942, a man arrived at Eagle Farm Depot who had been sent there to end Paul Gunn's career. His name was Jack Fox. He was 35 years old. He wore a tie under his flight jacket. He worked for North American Aviation, the company that manufactured the B-25 Mitchell. His title was Field Service Engineer. His orders were simple. He had been sent from the North American factory in Inglewood, California, to observe Captain Gunn's unauthorized modifications and file a report recommending immediate discontinuation of the program. The company was worried. The Army Air Force had not approved these modifications. The airplanes being cut apart in Brisbane were still legally the property of North American Aviation until formal delivery. If Gunn's welded gun mounts caused a crash, if the fuselage skin buckled from muzzle blast, if the center of gravity shift caused the pilot to die on takeoff, the company would be liable. Jack Fox arrived expecting to find a lunatic. What he found was a mechanic. Gunn showed him the frame he had built. He showed him where he had moved the radio equipment. He showed him the lead weights he had bolted to the tail. He explained why he had used 4 guns instead of 6. He explained the muzzle blast tubes he was welding to extend beyond the propeller arc so the exhaust would not peel the aluminum skin. Fox listened. He asked technical questions. Gunn answered them. The answers were not textbook. They were empirical. Gunn had tested each modification by flying it and watching what happened. Fox stayed for 2 weeks. At the end of the 2 weeks, he did not file the report North American had sent him to file. Instead, he sent a message to the factory in Inglewood. It read, "The modifications are sound. The concept works. Recommend factory integration." The man sent to shut down the program had just become its most important ally. Paul Gunn did not know it yet, but a war was about to begin over his airplanes. It would be fought not in New Guinea but in Washington. The engineers at Wright Field in Ohio, the highest technical authority in the United States Army Air Force, were going to write a formal report declaring that everything Paul Gunn had built was impossible. They were going to recommend grounding every modified B-25 in the Pacific. They were going to be proven wrong in 72 hours by 12 airplanes flown by a 25-year-old captain over a stretch of ocean called the Bismarck Sea. But that had not happened yet. In September 1942, Gunn stood in a hangar in Brisbane, a wrench in his hand, 3 years and 5 months before he would see his wife again. He picked up the wrench. He got back to work. Buna Airfield sat on the northern coast of New Guinea, 300 miles across the Owen Stanley Mountains from Port Moresby. The Japanese had captured it in July 1942. They had turned it into a forward air base. Zeros and Betty bombers operated from its runway. They struck Allied positions in the mountains. They protected the transports moving down the coast. The 5th Air Force had been trying to neutralize Buna for 2 months. B-17S had bombed it from high altitude. Nothing changed. The Japanese repaired the runway overnight and flew missions the next morning. In September 1942, modified A-20 Havocs took off from Port Moresby before dawn. Each airplane carried 450 caliber machine guns in the nose. Each pilot had been briefed by Paul Gunn personally in a tent behind a hangar in Brisbane. The A-20s crossed the Owen Stanleys at 12,000 feet. On the other side of the mountains they descended. They came down through the clouds. They leveled off at 50 feet above the jungle canopy. They arrived over Buna Airfield at 700 hours. The Japanese anti-aircraft crews were eating breakfast. The A-20s came in line, abreast machine guns, firing simultaneously. The muzzle flashes made the nose of each airplane look like it was on fire. They walked the guns across the airfield. They shredded parked aircraft. They killed anti-aircraft gunners at their weapons before those gunners could traverse a single barrel. The attack lasted 4 minutes. When the A-20s pulled up and turned back toward the mountains, the Japanese airfield at Buna was burning. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Every anti-aircraft position had been silenced. Not a single A-20 was lost. Kenny read the after-action report that night in his office in Brisbane. He read it twice. Then he picked up the telephone and called Eagle Farm Depot. He told Paul Gunn to start working on B-25s. The North American B-25. Mitchell was a bigger airplane than the A-20. It had 2 engines, twin tails, a crew of 6 and a range of 1,300 miles. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs. It could reach any target in New Guinea from bases in Australia. It was the airplane the 5th Air Force needed to win the war in the Southwest Pacific. But like the A-20, it was designed for horizontal bombing from medium altitude. Its nose was made of clear plexiglass. Behind that plexiglass sat a bombardier, a young man with a northern bomb sight and no way to defend himself. Gunn stared at the nose of the first B-25 wheeled into his hangar in October 1942. Then he picked up a hacksaw. He cut the plexiglass off. He cut the bombardier station out with a torch. He built a new nose out of sheet aluminum, solid, no windows. Just a flat grey plate with 4 holes for 450 caliber machine guns. He mounted the guns. He added 2 more guns in external packs on each side of the fuselage, the cheek guns. Then he stepped back and counted. 4 guns in the nose, 2 guns on the left cheek, 2 guns on the right cheek, 8 50 caliber machine guns, all firing forward, all firing at the same target. The ground crew standing beside him did not say anything at first. Then one of them, a sergeant named Mitchell, no relation to the airplane, laughed and said the whole thing looked like Pappy's Folly. The name stuck. The airplane rolled out of the hangar the next morning. It was the first commerce destroyer. It would not be the last. While Gunn welded gun mounts in Brisbane, a different kind of experiment was happening in New Guinea. Major William Garnett Benn was 32 years old. He was a West Point graduate class of 1933. He was tall, thin and quiet. Before the war, he had served as an aide to General Kenny in Washington. When Kenny took command of the 5th Air Force, he brought Ben with him. Kenny gave Ben the 63rd Bomb Squadron and one specific job: find a way to hit ships with heavy bombers. Ben read every anti-shipping report he could find. He studied British anti-shipping attacks in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. He studied German attacks on Allied convoys. He studied everything. And then he had an idea. If a bomber flew low enough, really low, 50 feet or less, and released the bomb at the right speed, the bomb would not fall into the water. It would skip, like a stone thrown across a pond. The bomb would skip once, twice, 3 times across the water. It would hit the side of the target ship. If the fuse was set with a 4-second delay, the bomb would explode inside the hull below the waterline. He called it skip bombing. He needed to test it. He needed a target. The SS Prut was a British steamer that had run aground on Natiara Reef outside Port Moresby in December 1923. Its rusting hull had been sitting on the reef for 19 years. It was the perfect target. Ben took a B-17 down to 50 feet above the water. He flew straight at the wreck. He released a 500-pound bomb at exactly the right moment. The bomb hit the water. It skipped once. It skipped twice. It hit the side of the SS Prut and exploded. Ben flew back to Port Moresby and told Kenny the technique worked. Kenny told him to teach it to every squadron in the 5th Air Force. By January 1943, 40 B-25 crews had been trained in skip bombing. On the morning of January 18, 1943, Major William Ben took off from Port Moresby in a B-25 Mitchell on a reconnaissance flight over Japanese positions. He did not come back. He was never heard from again. No distress call, no radio contact, no wreckage. He was 32 years old. He left behind a wife and family in the United States. The man who had invented the tactic that would destroy the Japanese convoy vanished 6 weeks before that destruction happened. 50 miles inland from Port Moresby, in a valley in the Owen Stanley Mountains, his aircraft lay in dense jungle. The 5th Air Force searched for 2 weeks. They found nothing. The wreck of Ben's B-25 was finally located in 1957. That was the same year Paul Gunn died. Both men, the inventor of skip bombing and the builder of the Strafer, would be found in mountain wreckage 14 years apart in aircraft they had trusted. But that was 14 years in the future. In January 1943, the 5th Air Force lost a major and gained a doctrine. The airplanes kept flying. Captain Edward Larner was 25 years old. He was tall, lean, and sharp-featured. He wore his flight cap pushed back on his head. He smoked constantly. He spoke rarely, and when he spoke his voice was flat and quiet. He commanded the 90th Bomb Squadron of the 3rd Attack Group. The squadron's nickname was Pero Dice. Larner had flown A-20s over Buna in September. He had seen what 450 caliber machine guns could do to a Japanese airfield. When the 90th transitioned to modified B-25s, Larner did not ask questions. He did ask for one thing. He asked Papi Gunn to teach him personally. Gunn flew to Port Moresby in December 1942. He spent 2 weeks with the 90th Bomb Squadron. He taught them how to fly the modified B-25s. He taught them how nose-heavy the airplanes were on takeoff. He taught them how to compensate for the muzzle blast that shook the entire airframe when all 8 guns fired at once. He taught them how to skip bomb. 50 feet above the water, 240 knots. Release the bomb at 300 yards from the target. Pull up hard. Turn away before the bomb hits. Larner practiced the technique for 2 weeks. He crashed no airplanes. He killed no crews. He was the best strafer pilot in the theater by the middle of January. He was also drinking. The men who flew with him said Larner was afraid of nothing while he was in the air. In the air, he was a machine. On the ground, he was a young man who had watched too many friends burn. He was 25 years old. He had 2 years left to live. He did not know that yet. While Larner trained his squadron in New Guinea, a formal report was being written in Ohio. Wright Field near Dayton was the technical headquarters of the United States Army Air Force. It was where engineers evaluated every modification to every combat aircraft. It was where design decisions became doctrine. In February 1943, a copy of Paul Gunn's B-25 modifications reached Wright Field. The engineers studied the modifications for 3 days. They calculated the center of gravity shift caused by the added weight in the nose. They calculated the stress on the fuselage skin from 8 guns firing simultaneously. They calculated the aerodynamic effects of removing the plexiglass nose and replacing it with a flat aluminum plate. They wrote a formal report. The report concluded that the modifications were structurally unsound. It concluded that the airplanes would fail in combat. It concluded that the muzzle blast would eventually peel the aluminum skin off the fuselage. It concluded that the center of gravity shift would make the airplanes uncontrollable at low speeds. The report recommended that every modified B-25 in the Pacific be grounded immediately. It was signed by senior engineers with degrees from Cornell, Michigan and the California Institute of Technology. It was sent to General Henry Arnold, Chief of the United States Army Air Force in Washington. Arnold received the report on February 24, 1943. He put it in a folder on his desk. He was scheduled to review it the following week. While the report sat on Arnold's desk in Washington, another paper was moving through another set of hands in another building 6,000 miles away. Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, known as FRUMEL, was a joint American and Australian code-breaking operation. It occupied a fortified basement in a Victorian building on St. Kilda Road in Melbourne. Dozens of code breakers worked there, most of them under the age of 30, most of them exhausted. They spent their days breaking Japanese naval codes. They broke Naval Code JN-25. They broke Merchant Marine Code S. On the morning of February 28, 1943, they broke a message that had been transmitted from the Japanese naval headquarters at Rabaul. The message described the convoy that was leaving Rabaul on the morning of March 1st. The convoy had 8 transport ships. It had 8 destroyer escorts. It had 6,900 Japanese soldiers aboard, drawn from the 51st Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi. The destination was Lae, on the northern coast of New Guinea. The escort commander was Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. His flagship was the destroyer Shirayuki. The convoy would arrive at Lae before dawn on March 4th. FRUMEL sent the decrypted intelligence to 5th Air Force headquarters that afternoon. General Kenny read it at 7 o'clock in the evening on February 28th. He had 72 hours. The weather began to change on March 1st. The southwest monsoon arrived early that year. Heavy cloud cover blanketed the Bismarck Sea from the Vitiaz Strait in the south to the New Britain coast in the north. Visibility dropped to less than a mile in places. Rain squalls swept across the ocean in dense curtains. Admiral Kimura's convoy sailed into this weather at 1900 hours on March 1st. Kimura believed the weather was his ally. He was right at first. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flew search patterns across the Bismarck Sea on March 1st and again on March 2nd. They saw almost nothing. The cloud ceiling was 3,000 feet. The rain squalls hid the convoy for hours at a time. At 1400 hours on March 2nd, a single B-24 Liberator spotted the convoy through a break in the clouds. The pilot reported the position, the composition, and the course. Kenny ordered an immediate attack. 8 B-17 took off from Port Moresby. They flew north through the weather. They reached the convoy at 1700 hours. They dropped their bombs from 15,000 feet. The bombs fell through cloud breaks. Some fell into empty ocean. Some fell close enough to a transport ship to shake its hull. One transport Kyokusei Maru was hit. It sank that evening. The rest of the convoy sailed on. At the end of the day, on March 2nd, one Japanese ship had been sunk out of 16. The strafers had not yet flown. The evening of March 2nd, 1943, in a tent at Port Moresby, Captain Edward Larner briefed the 90th Bomb Squadron. The tent was lit by 2 hurricane lamps. The pilot sat on wooden crates. Larner stood in front of a hand-drawn map of the Bismarck Sea. He held a stick. He pointed at the northern coast of New Guinea. He spoke for 12 minutes. He said the following. 12 modified B-25 Mitchells from the 90th Bomb Squadron would depart Port Moresby at 0600 hours on March 3rd. They would rendezvous over Cape Ward Hunt at 0700 with 13 A-20 Havocs from the 89th Bomb Squadron, 13 BO Fighter. Fighter bombers from No. 30 Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, 16 B-17, S from the 43rd Bomb Group, and a screening force of P-38 Lightnings from the 39th Fighter Squadron. They would attack the Japanese convoy at approximately 1000 hours. The B-17S would attack first from 10,000 feet. Their job was to draw Japanese anti-aircraft fire upward and pull Japanese fighter cover away from the surface. The Beaufighters would attack second. They would fly at 50 feet in line abreast. They would fire their 420mm cannons and 6 wing-mounted machine guns at the ship's bridges. The Japanese would think they were being attacked by torpedo aircraft. The Japanese would turn their ships bow on to reduce the torpedo target. At the moment the ships turned, the strafers would come in. The B-25s of the 90th Bomb Squadron would attack from the port beam of the convoy. The A-20s of the 89th Bomb Squadron would attack from the starboard beam. They would fly at 50 feet above the water. They would fire 850 caliber machine guns per airplane. They would release skip bombs at 300 yards from the target. The bombs would skip across the water. The bombs would hit the sides of the ships. The bombs would detonate inside the hulls. Larner finished briefing at 2200 hours. A young navigator in the second row raised his hand and asked what would happen if the strafers took anti-aircraft fire during the approach. Larner looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Tomorrow we find out." The plan Kenny had approved was the largest coordinated multi-squadron attack the 5th Air Force had ever attempted. It required the perfect coordination of 6 different squadrons, 3 different aircraft types, 2 different national air forces and radio communication protocols that had never been tested under combat conditions. Every squadron had trained separately. No full-scale rehearsal had been possible. The B-25 strafers themselves had never been used in combat as a squadron. Individual airplanes had flown missions. Individual pilots had scored hits. But 12 modified B-25s attacking a single convoy in formation at 50 feet in coordination with Beaufighters, and at 20s this had never happened. The tactic being used had never been tested at full scale. The airplanes being used had been declared unsound by the highest technical authority in the United States Army Air Force. The commander who had approved the mission was a lieutenant general who had spent 4 hours reading intelligence reports and then bet the campaign for New Guinea on 12 airplanes flown by a 25-year-old captain over 100 miles of open water in the worst weather of the year. The engineer who had designed the airplanes was 2,000 miles away in a tent behind a hangar in Brisbane waiting for word. His daughter had stopped growing. He did not know that. He knew only that the airplanes were flying. At 0600 hours on March 3, 1943, 12 B-25 Mitchells lifted off from Jackson Airfield at Port Moresby. The engines were the loudest sound in the morning. The sky was pale grey. The strafers turned north. They headed for the Bismarck Sea. The Bismarck Sea on the morning of March 3, 1943 was grey from horizon to horizon. The cloud ceiling had lifted overnight. Visibility was 15 miles. The wind was out of the southeast at 10 knots. The swell was low. It was the first clear morning in 4 days. Admiral Kimura stood on the bridge of the Shirayuki at 1000 hours. He was 52 years old. He wore a khaki uniform. He held a pair of binoculars in his left hand. He was looking up. 16 B-17 flying fortresses came out of the clouds at 10,000 feet. They dropped their bombs. The bombs fell through the sky in long silent arcs. Kimura ordered the convoy to disperse. The ships turned in different directions. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Black puffs bloomed in the sky around the bombers. One B-17 took a hit in its left wing and turned back toward Port Moresby, trailing smoke. Every Japanese sailor on every deck of every ship was looking up. That was the mistake. The Beaufighters came in low at 50 feet above the water. 13 airplanes, line abreast, painted dark green and grey, 4 20mm cannons in each nose, 6 wing-mounted machine guns. They opened fire at 800 yards. The cannon shells walked across the water in white feathers of spray. Then they walked up the sides of the transport ships. Then they walked across the bridges. The Japanese saw them at the last moment. They thought the Beaufighters were carrying torpedoes. The transport captains gave the order every anti-torpedo doctrine required. They turned their ships bow on to the attackers. They presented the narrowest possible target to what they believed was an incoming torpedo run. The maneuver was correct. The maneuver was fatal, because the Beaufighters were not carrying torpedoes. And behind the Beaufighters, at 50 feet at 240 knots, were 12 B-25 Mitchells, with 850 caliber machine guns each. Captain Edward Larner flew the lead airplane. His crew called it Ruthless. he saw the transport Teiyo Maru turning bow on to the bowfighters. He saw the ship's port side rotating slowly toward him, long exposed, undefended. He pushed the throttles forward. He said one word into his headset. Now! The 90th Bomb Squadron descended to 50 feet and opened fire. Nearly 150 caliber machine guns fired at the same moment. The sound of the guns was so loud that pilots in the rear of the formation heard nothing but their own heartbeats for the next 20 seconds. The bullets walked across the water. They hit the side of the Teiyo Maru. They walked up the hull. They walked across the deck. They killed anti-aircraft gunners at their weapons. They killed sailors carrying ammunition. They killed officers standing on the bridge. The bridge windows shattered. The bridge crew was killed. Larner released his bombs at 300 yards. 2 500-pound bombs. They hit the water once. They hit the water twice. They hit the side of the ship and stopped. 4 seconds later, they detonated inside the hull. The Teiyo Maru broke in half. Japanese soldiers below decks were thrown into the sea in full combat gear. Their packs weighed 60 pounds. Their rifles weighed 9 pounds. Their boots filled with water in seconds. Most of them never surfaced. The ship sank within minutes. Larner banked hard to the right and pulled up. His co-pilot looked back over his shoulder at the burning transport and did not say anything. Behind Larner, 11 more B-25s were doing the same thing to 11 more ships. At the same time, 13 A-20 Havocs of the 89th Bomb Squadron were attacking from the starboard beam. Their pilots came in low. Their bombs skipped, their guns hammered. 2 more transports began to burn. By 1000 hours and 15 minutes, 6 transports were on fire. By 1000 hours and 20 minutes, 3 of them were sinking. The Japanese convoy had ceased to exist as a fighting formation. It was now a collection of burning ships trying to survive. At 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane, General Kenny received the first situation report at 1100 hours. He read it standing up. He read it twice. Then he sat down at his desk and wrote a cable to General Henry Arnold in Washington. The cable was 98 words long. It described the attack that had just been completed. It listed the ships confirmed sunk. It confirmed the tactics used and the aircraft involved. The final sentence read, "Request immediate factory integration of forward gun package into all B-25 production aircraft." He signed it. He handed it to the radio operator. The cable was transmitted at 11:15 hours on March 3, 1943. At the same moment in Washington, D.C., General Arnold was reviewing the Wright Field report on his desk. He was reading the paragraph that recommended grounding every modified B-25 in the Pacific. His secretary walked into the office with the cable from Brisbane. He read the cable. He looked at the report. He looked at the cable again. He closed the folder. He never opened it again. The Wright Field engineers, who had signed the report, never received a formal response. Their conclusions were quietly overridden. The modifications they had declared unsound became standard equipment on every B-25G, every B-25H, and every late production B-25J that rolled off the North American aviation assembly line for the remainder of the war. Thousands of them. Every one of them carried Paul Gunn's guns. The attacks continued through the afternoon of March 3rd and into the morning of March 4th. Fresh formations of B-25s and A-20s rotated over the target area. Fresh bombs, fresh ammunition. The Japanese fighter cover had been depleted by the first attack. There was no defense left in the sky above the burning convoy. By the evening of March 4th, the accounting was final. 8 transport ships sunk, 4 destroyer escorts sunk, 12 ships in total. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers dead. Historians still debate the exact number. Approximately 2,700 rescued by the 4 surviving destroyers and returned to Rabaul. The rest were lost in the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses were 5 aircraft, 1 B-17, 1 B-25 and 3 P-38s and 13 airmen. The 51st Division's ability to reinforce Leh had been destroyed. General MacArthur, who had followed the battle from his headquarters in Brisbane, later described the action in a formal communique as one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. The Japanese never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by daylight convoy. The war in the Southwest Pacific had turned. But it had turned with a cost that would not appear in any communique. On the afternoon of March 4th and the morning of March 5th, Allied aircraft returned to the sinking area. They flew low over the wreckage. They found Japanese soldiers in the water, some clinging to lifeboats, some clinging to floating debris, some swimming toward the New Guinea coast. The pilots opened fire. They strafed the men in the water. They strafed the lifeboats. They killed hundreds of survivors. Some historians estimate the number at more than 1,000. The order to strafe survivors had been issued by General Kenny himself. He documented the decision openly in his memoir 6 years after the war. He wrote that Japanese soldiers reaching the New Guinea coast would rejoin their army and kill Australian and American soldiers in the jungle. He wrote that stopping them in the water was a military necessity. Many Allied pilots followed the order. Some did not. Some pilots deliberately missed. Some refused to fire at men in the water and were formally reprimanded upon return to base. The strafing of the Bismarck Sea survivors remains one of the most morally difficult episodes of the Pacific War. It was legal under the rules of engagement of 1943. It was defended by senior commanders. It was carried out by ordinary young men in airplanes designed by a 43-year-old captain who was 2,000 miles away and did not know it was happening. There is no clean way to tell this part of the story. There is only the record of what was ordered, what was done, and what the men who did it carried for the rest of their lives. Some of them never spoke about it. Some of them spoke about it only in the last years of their lives to their grandchildren in small quiet rooms with tears in their eyes. Paul Gunn was not in the Bismarck Sea on March 3, 1943. He learned about the attack from a radio bulletin at Eagle Farm Depot 2 days later. He did not celebrate. He sat on his cot for a long time. Then he stood up and went back to the hangar and started welding gun mounts on the next B-25. In late March 1943, General Kenny ordered Gunn to fly to California. North American Aviation needed him at the factory in Inglewood. The company was preparing to integrate his modifications into series production. Jack Fox, the field service engineer who had once been sent to end the program, had already begun the technical drawings. But the modifications needed the man who had built them to explain them. Gunn did not want to go. California was in the wrong direction. Manila was north. Kenny made it an order. He told Gunn the 5th Air Force needed factory-built strafers. He told Gunn he would be back in the Pacific within 6 weeks. Gunn packed a duffel bag and boarded a C-54 transport at Amberley Field. 2 days later, he landed on the west coast. The North American aviation plant covered 140 acres. Thousands of workers, 3 shifts, 1 B-25 rolling off the assembly line every few hours. The factory engineers studied Gunn's hand-drawn blueprints. They asked about stress calculations. He told them he did not have any. They asked about wind tunnel testing. He told them he had tested the modifications by flying them. They asked about the center of gravity problem. He showed them where he had moved the radio equipment aft to compensate. An engineer named Harrison said the muzzle blast would peel the aluminum skin off the fuselage. Gunn agreed. He said it already had. Then he showed them the blast tubes he had welded onto the guns to redirect the exhaust beyond the propeller arc. Problem solved. The factory engineers spent 2 weeks reverse engineering his field modifications into production drawings. They strengthened the nose structure. They redesigned the gun mounts. They added heavier gauge aluminum patches to reinforce the fuselage skin. They calculated the exact center of gravity shift and adjusted the tail trim accordingly. In May 1943, the first factory-built B-25G rolled off the assembly line. It carried 450 caliber machine guns in a solid nose. It carried a 75mm cannon in the forward fuselage. The cannon fired shells the size of a man's forearm. Gunn test flew the prototype himself. He fired the cannon at a target barge in the Pacific. The recoil pushed the airplane backward 4 feet. The navigator had to reload the cannon manually between shots. Rate of fire was 1 round every 30 seconds. Gunn told the engineers it would work. He said it would work against ships. He said it would not work against anything faster than a ship. He was right on both counts. The B-25G was followed by the B-25H, which added 4 more 50 caliber machine guns in the cheek packs and improved the cannon's recoil system. Then came the B-25J. The late production B-25J installed 8 50 caliber machine guns in the solid nose, 4 more in cheek packs, 2 more in the forward firing turret, a total of 14 forward firing machine guns. It was one of the most heavily armed production bombers ever built. North American aviation built more than 4,000 B-25Js. They delivered the first ones to the Pacific in October 1943. Every one of them carried Paul Gunn's guns. Gunn returned to Australia in May 1943. He had been gone 6 weeks exactly. His family was still in Manila. Captain Edward Larner did not live to see the B-25J. On April 30th, 1943, Larner was flying a practice mission out of Dobodura airfield in New Guinea. He was performing a chandela climbing turn used to reverse direction and gain altitude. The maneuver was standard. He had performed it hundreds of times. Something went wrong. The airplane stalled at the top of the climb. It fell into a spin. It hit the ground and exploded. Larner was killed instantly. He was 25 years old. He had been the commanding officer of the 90th Bomb Squadron for 8 months. He had led the strafer attack that destroyed the Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea 58 days earlier. He had received the Distinguished Service Cross. Paul Gunn kept flying missions through 1943 and 1944. He flew supply runs. He flew reconnaissance. He flew combat missions when he could get authorization, and he flew them without authorization when he could not. He was promoted to major in August 1943. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in March 1944. He was promoted to colonel in October 1944. Every promotion took him closer to Manila. The intelligence reports from Santo Tomas were getting worse. Food rations had been cut in half in 1944, then cut again. Prisoners were dying of malnutrition. The Japanese camp commander had informed the International Red Cross that all internees would be executed if Allied forces approached the city. Gunn told General Kenny he wanted to fly the first mission over Manila when the liberation came. Kenny told him he could. On October 20, 1944, American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines. The liberation of Manila was 3.5 months away. Gunn's family had been in Santo Tomas for 2 years and 9 months. He was 45 years old. He was flying multiple missions every day. He told his crew chief he would not stop until his family was free. In the early hours of November 27, 1944, Japanese bombers attacked Tacloban airfield on Leyte. Betty bombers escorted by Zero fighters. They came in low from the north. The radar operators saw them too late. Gunn was in the operations tent reviewing mission plans for the morning strike when the first bombs hit. The tent was 200 yards from the main runway. Too close. The blast wave knocked him off his feet. Shrapnel tore through the canvas walls. A fragment hit Gunn in the left leg. Another hit his shoulder. A medical officer found him 30 minutes later trying to stand. Blood had soaked through his flight suit. Gunn said he needed to check on his aircraft. The doctor said he needed surgery. Gunn made it 30 feet before he collapsed. They evacuated him to the field hospital at Leyte. The leg wound was serious. The shrapnel had severed an artery. The surgeon said Gunn would not fly again for 6 months minimum. The surgeon also said Gunn qualified for medical retirement. 45 years old. Decades of military service. He had earned the right to go home. Gunn told the surgeon he was not going anywhere until his family was free. The Battle of Manila began on February 3, 1945. American forces fought house to house through the city. The Japanese had declared Manila a fortress. They would defend every street. Santo Tomas internment camp was liberated at 20:45 hours on the evening of February 3rd. 3,700 internees were freed. Polygon weighed 89 pounds. Julie weighed 63 pounds. Nathaniel had malaria. Connie Ann had dysentery. Paul Jr. had lost so much weight that his mother had trouble recognizing him. They were all alive. They had been in Santo Tomas for 3 years and 1 month. Gunn flew to Manila on the morning of February 4th against medical orders. His leg was still bandaged. He was using a cane. The doctor had cleared him for light duty only. No combat flying, no unauthorized flights. He went anyway. He landed near Manila. He drove to Santo Tomas. He found his family in the makeshift hospital the army had set up in the former dining hall. Polly did not recognize him at first. He had lost 40 pounds since she had last seen him. His hair had gone completely white. He walked toward her, slowly, favoring his left leg. She looked up. She saw a thin, gray-haired man in an American colonel's uniform. She thought he was a doctor. Then he said her name. She started crying. She could not stop crying for a long time. The reunion lasted 4 hours. Then Gunn returned to Leyte. His medical leave was not over. But the war was not over either. The modified B-25s kept flying. Other pilots. Other crews. But Paul Gunn's guns. By the end of the war in August 1945, North American aviation had built 9,800 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Thousands of them carried the forward-firing gun package that Gunn had designed in a hangar in Brisbane in 1942. Those airplanes had sunk hundreds of Japanese ships. They had destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft on the ground. They had killed tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers. The commerce destroyer concept, the idea that a bomber could carry so many forward-firing guns, that it could suppress a ship's defenses long enough to skip bomb it at point-blank range, had become one of the decisive weapons of the Pacific War. Paul Gunn never flew combat again after February 1945. The leg wound ended his operational career. The army retired him as a full colonel on June 30, 1948. He was 48 years old. He returned to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines from war surplus transport aircraft. He flew routes between Manila, Cebu, and Davao. By 1946, PAL had begun trans-Pacific flights to San Francisco. Gunn flew constantly. He could not stop moving. On the morning of October 11, 1957, Gunn chartered a Beech model 18 twin-engine airplane from Manila. He was flying to Baguio in the mountains of northern Luzon. Routine trip, 140 miles. Weather forecast showed scattered thunderstorms over the Cordillera Mountains, but nothing severe. He filed his flight plan at 800 hours. The tower cleared him for takeoff at 928 hours. The weather deteriorated faster than the forecast predicted. By 10:30, the Cordillera Mountains were soaked in with heavy rain, low visibility and severe turbulence. The Beechcraft's radio went silent at 10:47. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage 3 days later on a mountainside near Baguio. The airplane had flown into a storm cell. The pilots had tried to climb above it. The winds had driven them into the ridge. Impact killed everyone aboard. Paul Irving Gunn died on October 11, 1957. He was 57 years old. He was 7 days short of his 58th birthday. The Philippine government gave him a state funeral. 6,000 people attended. American veterans, Philippine Airlines employees, former internees from Santo Tomas. General Kenny sent a wreath from the United States. Kenny wrote in his memoir that Gunn's mechanical genius had changed the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. He wrote that without the Strafer modifications, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea would not have been a victory. Kenny and MacArthur both praised Gunn's contributions during and after the war. He was recommended for further promotion at the end of the conflict, but the recommendation was not approved. The Army Air Force was reducing its force structure. Promotions to general officer were frozen. Gunn remained a colonel. He never complained. He had gotten what he fought for. His family was free. The Philippines were liberated. The Japanese were defeated. That was enough. The son, who had weighed less than 100 pounds at Santo Tomas, grew up to fly in the United States Air Force. He wrote a biography of his father years later. The children who came out of Santo Tomas grew up. They lived. They had families of their own. Polly Gunn lived out the rest of her life in the Philippines. She was buried beside her husband, a 43-year-old captain in oil-stained coveralls, a wife who did not know she was about to be taken, 4 children who would come out of Santo Tomas thinner, older, and quieter than they went in, an airplane called Papi's Folly, a convoy of 12 ships that never reached Lae, a morally difficult afternoon over the Bismarck Sea that no one who was there ever forgot, a war that turned in a hangar in Brisbane 3 years before it ended, and the man who flew home the long way through Buna, through California, through Leyte, through the ruins of Manila, and who lived for 12 more years in the country he had once flown out of. until the mountains he had flown over 10,000 times finally caught him one grey October morning in 1957. The airplanes he built are still in museums. The men who flew them are almost all gone now. But every time an A-10 Warthog or a modern gunship opens up with its forward-firing guns, every time a strike aircraft suppresses a target with concentrated cannon fire before releasing ordnance, every time an engineer looks at an airframe and decides it needs more guns and fewer windows. Somewhere in the design lineage, there is a 43-year-old captain in oil-stained coveralls welding a machine gun mount inside the nose of a bomber that the highest technical authority in his own army had declared impossible. The engineers were wrong, the captain was right, and his wife weighed 89 pounds when he found her again.